All right, I believe we are good to go. So I wanted to start this off by saying hello and welcome to everyone to Greenpeace Winnipeg's live panel discussion, post-video discussion of There's Something in the Water. My name is Cam Shepard. I am from Greenpeace Winnipeg, and I'll be moderating tonight's panel discussion. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge that the lands which many of us are located on are the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I understand this is not just a Manitoba thing, and that others of us are definitely from other treaty lands, and some of us also including from the lands where the video was filmed, situated on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. But regardless of where we are, we respect the treaties that were made on these territories, acknowledging the harms and mistakes made in the past, and dedicating ourselves to moving forward with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation. So I wanted to thank you all for signing up, for being with us here today during this worldwide pandemic that's become our new reality of daily life. But I'm really thankful that at least we can meet virtually in our basements, in our kitchens, wherever we may be, to celebrate Earth Day. So I want to also express our heartfelt concerns for a couple things that are going on right now. First of all, those affected by COVID-19. Definitely we're thinking of those people at this time, but also watching this video this past week, and then hearing about the shaking events that happened this weekend, the mass shootings in Nova Scotia. I felt such a connection just from watching this video to Nova Scotia. I wanted to, extend our sincerest sympathies on behalf of the Greenpeace family to anyone affected by this weekend's events and those in Nova Scotia as well. So on a lighter note, I am here with three wonderful humans. Eric Gould, a climate activist and Greenpeace Halifax organizer. Dr. Shirley Thompson, associate professor at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Manitoba. And Eduardo Rodriguez da Costa, an economist, development practitioner, and peace scholar from the Brazilian Amazon region. Hello to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. So we'll be having a bit of a discussion on the topics brought up from There's Something in the Water. And we're gonna have a few different questions. We're gonna go into specific questions for each of our panelists, some overarching questions. Then we're gonna get into a bit of a Q&A on some of the questions that you guys may have posed our viewers on the Netflix party if you joined us, or if you do have some questions about the video or just environmental racism or activism in general that you wanted to ask, we just use the chat on the side of the YouTube channel here, and we can try and address some of those questions, time permitting. So first, I wanted to chat with you, Eric, a little bit. Eric, you were from Halifax area and from Nova Scotia. How has Nova Scotia or Halifax responded to this film being created?
Yeah, so I mean, everybody in Nova Scotia it's such a tight knit community, and going back to what you mentioned earlier about the events that just happened this weekend, it's really showing how everybody is so connected here, and it's not just when you're dealing with a pandemic or such a traumatic event like that just happened, but even when it comes to the environment, like we're so connected with nature here. You can drive 1 hour any way and you're at the ocean. It's beautiful. It's paradise, really. I'm so grateful to be from here, and to be an environmental activist. The strength in the community is it's just overwhelming. It's such an empowering place to be an activist. So, of course, a lot of the issues that were brought up in this film were well known to much of the community. Um, I remember when the film first premiered at the Atlantic Film Fest. I couldn't go to that actually, but I had a lot of friends who went, and so I saw, everybody had their Instagram stories or their Snapchat videos, and I mean, it was just a sold out show. It was extremely welcoming because not only is it something that's so dear to us, but we love Ellen Page here. She's a champion. She's so talented. She's incredibly humble. Um, She's, you know, she's a feminist. She's a champion for LGBTQ plus rights. You know, she's just like she's the golden child of Nova Scotia. So for somebody who is you know, so important to us to have done something that is so important to us, um, you know, it was just such a great thing. So the whole community, I'm pretty sure I've seen the movie half a dozen times. You know, everybody I know has seen the film. You know, it's something that we're all so proud of. um, and it's you know, it's a great it's a great piece of work to show some of the work that our community has done and some of the issues that we're still fighting today.
Amazing. And I think, like you said, you know, it's you almost feel like it's your own, right? It's like this is home for me, and so to share it with other people, any opportunity, it's just amazing. I know, watching that video, I really thought they'd leave us on that cliffhanger. You know, I was like, okay, so wait, the government's given them 5 years. Now they're just going to extend it longer and longer. So can you tell me what has happened since the pulp and paper mill closed? As what's been going on there?
So the film leans off with they announced that there will be no more deadlines to the Boat Harbor Act. I'm happy to say that our government held strong with that. As of January 31st, the pulp mill closed down. There's no more production. Um, Unfortunately, they're still pumping water through the pipes. They're still pumping water into Boat Harbor. Um, the aerators aren't running as much. There's not as much of the pulp that you see in the harbor there. Um, they're it's a bit controversial because the First Nations weren't really consulted with the fact that they're going to continue pumping water through the pipes to flush them out. It was kind of a dirty trick. Northern Pulp, they've known for you know, a long time when they were, you know, supposed to stop. So they just pushed it, and now here they are. But on a brighter note, I'm told from the last thing I heard is that at the end of this month, at the end of April, there will be no more water going through the pipes. They're going to be finished flushing it out, and then they're going to completely decommission um, the uh, the treatment plant that runs into Boat Harbor. So that's great news. Also, just last week, Andrea Paul, the Pictou Landing First Nations chief, she had posted like a drone video going over the Boat Harbor, and it shows it looks so much better than what you'd seen in the film. So there is optimism, there is hope. The smell has gone down from what I've read, um, but still we have to deal with the cleanup, and I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. It's the type of thing where, you know, who's going to pay for it? You know, these are all the questions that are coming up now.
Absolutely. And that's something that, you know, is a lasting of so many of these projects, is the cleanup, right? And the millions and billions of dollars that is having to be invested in the cleanup aspect of things. You know, it may have seemed like a great idea at the time, but you see the actual cost monetarily, never mind just on the environment that is from these projects. So I appreciate so much all that, and that there is some positive things happening right now in these areas. Unfortunately, the situation is not just endemic to Nova Scotia. This is a problem that occurs across Canada and as well throughout the world. We have with us Dr. Shirley Thompson. So, Dr. Thompson, we know here in Manitoba, there's communities that don't have access to something that is essential to life, to potable water, an issue that's been unresolved for decades. Can you tell us how this experience in Nova Scotia relates here to Manitoba?
Yes. So the situation in Nova Scotia shows that environmental racism, the bads of environmental pollution, the waste sites, the emissions, many aspects, the environmental health impacts are larger in First Nations reserves. And that's true for Manitoba as well. When you see displaced communities in Manitoba, we have dams all over the place. Manitoba Hydro is huge on the scene here. It's only First Nations reserves. It's only Indigenous people who have been displaced. And similarly, when it's flooding, we have a history of flooding here in Manitoba. it was rerouted. So to a different watershed that targeted First Nations communities. And those communities, if it had been any other community, they would be back in a few years. Since 2011, they're just coming back now. There aren't full houses for everyone. So they were only back 9 years, 8 years. Some people won't be back for 10 or 11 now. So that would not happen for any other community. As for drinking water, that's another issue, a huge issue under COVID. It's COVID-19. It's placing people at great risk. What are people told? They're told they have to wash their hands regularly. Well, what if you don't have running water? Recent survey was done by a student, a brilliant student, Lakeisha Barkman, a First Nations first year student, and she surveyed 384 houses in Garden Hill and found that 20%, actually 21%, but for emphasis, I'm saying 20, is were working out of barrels. And another 30% were using cisterns. Now, people are complaining that they have to worry constantly and ration their water if they're using cisterns. Barrels are no better, right? Or even worse. Bacterial contamination for barrels is absolutely, absolutely occurs. For cisterns, it's a much higher contamination rate. So the instances of things like H. pylori, which is the leading cause for stomach cancer and many other cancers, as well as many other diseases, tuberculosis, are very, very common. 50 times as more evident in First Nations on reserve communities than off reserve across Canada. So that's very problematic. Under COVID, what that's going to mean, tuberculosis is a lung disorder causing stress, which will make people more susceptible to COVID-19. So it's very, very relevant to what's happening right now. And it's really looking at, when we think of environmental racism or colonialism, it's not only the bads, it's also the lack of goods, right? Is the lack of access to parks, the lack of access to water, the lack of access to housing. And housing is a special issue on First Nations Reserve because banks don't loan money to First Nations. The only one who loans money is government, right? And government doesn't, so when they're under third party. So the case I want to give is the epicenter for H1N1, which was Garden Hill. So Garden Hill, after the H1N1 in 2009, 11 years after, is still 20% is drinking out of barrels. That for 9 years, they were in third party and were not given any money for housing. So actually their situation is worse for housing than it was with the H1N1. Now, 11 people died in Manitoba, but 3 of those cases were in Garden Hill, and they think another one was related. So this is a small population of a few thousand, and yet it was the epicenter. This was very many people, hundreds of people were sick, and many people died. And what did the government do? They flew in body bags, right? So that just shows the disdain and the lack of really dealing with problem, the readiness to deal with this problem. I think potentially now, we better be ready, because this is really, something that has to change, and we have to give our focus to infrastructure and equity on First Nations reserves and in other communities. I also look at Winnipeg. I look at lead in soil, and I see in South St. Boniface, in North Point Douglas, I'm digging up lead samples and seeing much higher. In fact, they break often, or sometimes at least, they break the industrial levels, right? And these are in people's homes or in the parkland. So there is, because of industry zoning with neighborhoods, with poor neighborhoods. You don't find industry, toxic industry next to rich neighborhoods. So these poor neighborhoods, you're seeing contamination and health impacts as well.
You bring up so many unbelievable points almost, right? The things like you said that we've known about for dozens of years and done nothing. And here, many of us are worrying about Lysol wipes and toilet paper when there's people who don't have access to clean water to wash their hands, right? It's pretty unfathomable, what some people are having to deal with, and the lack of care or accountability that should be placed on the government that hasn't happened. So you bring up a good point that we'll, I'm sure, chat about in a little bit. Wanted to jump into Eduardo. Wanted to look at to a little more of an international context as well. Looking at the Nova Scotia experience, how can you relate it to some of the environmental injustices the communities in the Amazonian area and the rainforest there have been experiencing?
Well, it's a very powerful film, right? And I would like to say that this film, I've been in Winnipeg for 5 years now, studying for a PhD, Peace and Conflict Studies at the U of M. 5 years is a long time, but this film took me home. This film was able to take me back home in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, where I come from, for two reasons, right? The first one is nature, the beauty of nature, the river, the appreciation for nature and its gifts, right? So this is mentioned throughout the movie. And the second reason is the challenges and the problems, right? Because it's amazing. It's amazing. It's the same dynamic, the same kinds of problems. It's waste management. It's dumps. It's pollution. It's water pollution. It's the lack of respect for the rights of indigenous peoples, right? The concern for water, right? Access to clean water, right? So what I would like to say is that this is a global problem, right? Yeah, if you consider that there are indigenous peoples all over the world, right? In whose lands, in whose territories are located the remaining natural resources in the world, right? So the remaining natural resources are located in remote areas where indigenous peoples live. And that's all over the world, right? So just thinking back to my reality in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, we have corporations willing to extract natural resources, and then you mostly mining, right? Mining companies, but not just mining companies. We have also a huge environmental impact from large-scale commercial agriculture, basically to grow soybeans in parts of the Amazon nowadays. And of course, the cattle industry as well. And what happens is that, I must say that, right? There's a big difference between Brazil and Canada, and I would like to mention that at this point, is that the way I see it, the institutions in Canada are much stronger. And I'm talking about institutions of society, right? I'm talking about non-government organizations. I'm talking about the judicial system. I'm talking about government organizations as well, right? They're way more solid and way stronger in Canada compared to Brazil, right? In the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, environmental activists and indigenous leaders, they are murdered on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, right? Yeah, it's like sometimes every month. And at the end of the day, it makes the news for one day, and then people just forget about it because it's just so common for those things to happen, right? So I see here in Canada, I have learned that we see that those leaders, like those grandmothers in the film, and those activists. They have a voice, they go, they protest, and they're respected, and their leaders are not murdered, right? So this is the big difference. This is the big difference.
No,
But
absolutely.
yeah, other than that, the challenges are the same. I think another difference is that I would say that in Brazil, the way I see it, there's some kind of certainty of impunity. Yeah, those corporations that cause those environmental damages, they somehow have connections with powerful politicians in Brazil, connections with powerful um, government connections. So in a way, they have this certainty of impunity. They know if something happens, they have enough money to pay better lawyers to defend their position. So at the end of the day, they really do not uh, face huge challenges. I don't have the exact figure at the top of my head, but I would say that for just an example, right, of the environmental fines that are applied in Brazil, right? Companies that cause an environmental damage, they are fined by the government, right? So I had a friend who did a study that was 5, 6 years ago that I think 2 or 3% of those fines get paid, 2 or 3%, and nothing happens. Nothing happens. So again, I think the film describes that very well, right? I think it's a problem, and I am a development practitioner, and I've studied a lot of international development in my life, right? At the end of the day, it comes to who has the power to make decisions and how are decisions made. Those are the two key questions that must be asked. And then once those questions are answered, and then we start the discussion, right? Yeah, those are my comments for now.
Amazing. And I think you bring up a lot of great points. Like, myself, considering myself an activist, as many people I think in this conversation would, it's pretty scary when you think about us not being able to voice our beliefs and our values without fear of death. Like you said, it is very common in Brazil. We feel that we've got a government or at least a legal system that would protect us. And although we may not, be trespassing or what it may be, we may be fined or thrown in jail, not at risk of death. So I think you bring up a really good point that we're going to sort of look into next, like, is that accountability aspect? And I'm going to sort of open it up to all three of our panelists. What can we do about accountability? Governments say one thing, but at the end of the day, it's sort of, we are the ones electing these governments, right? And so how can we hold our governments accountable for what they say? Like I had brought up earlier with Eric, I was almost mortified to hear that, okay, wait, the government said 5 years, they gave them a timeline, and now they're just going to push it back. Like, no, don't do it. And, like, but what can we do? How can accountability, what can we do?
Well, going back to with Northern Pulp, which they talked about in the film, going back to the cleanup, as of right now, Northern Pulp, they owe the Nova Scotian government, our provincial government, $86 million upwards of in loans that they're not going to pay back. The cleanup is estimated to cost over $200 million and take years, and that's all going to be tax dollars that are going to pay for it. I think the federal government committed to $100 million, and the provincial government's going to pay the rest. But if we allow them to do that, if we allow them to get away with it, then the next company's going to do it, and the next company's going to do it, and there's not going to be any change. So that's one thing, is we have to fight for our governments. We have to speak up. We have to tell them that we don't like this. We don't want to pay for this company who's been profiting. They've been making $200 million a year for however many they've been operating for about 60 years, and recently they've been earning about $200 million in profits. And where's the bank account that should have been set aside to pay for this? So I believe like that's the first step. But of course, that's coming from Canada. Going to a more international aspect of it, like in Brazil, with activists being murdered all the time. There's something that Eduardo, you can probably talk on it a lot more than me, but I heard of it in Costa Rica. I had some friends that was down there doing some environmental work, and they taught me about the Escazú Accord. Um, and it's basically it's a document that the purpose of it is to it's to make it's to provide transparent information on climate activity, and what's happening to these activists, because activists go missing and they're murdered all the time. I know people who have had death threats in Costa Rica. um, Eduardo can, I'm sure, speak to it a lot better than me. But that piece of legislation, the Escazú Accord, that not every country has signed yet. It's also a really good first step. The transparency and the commitment to transparency.
Absolutely. Like you said, those conversations, like Eduardo had mentioned as well, they need to happen. But please continue, Eduardo.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Very good question. I think the biggest challenge that we face in Brazil, right, is that there are many Brazils, right? Brazil is a country. It's not as big as Canada, but it's a really a big country. I think it's 4th or 5th largest country in the world, right? So we have many Brazils within Brazil, right? So most of the political leaders and nonprofit leaders in the Amazon rainforest, many of them say something like this. So Brazil considers the Amazon region a warehouse of natural resources that they can use whenever they want on their terms, not on our terms, right? So let me give you example, power dams, right? Which is also Dr. Shirley just mentioned the amount and the number of power dams in Manitoba. It's a big issue now in the Amazon. It's been for the last few decades, right? They're building power dams, but the electricity that is generated goes to southern Brazil, right? They build the transmission lines, and the electricity goes to supply southern Brazil, which is the most developed. Most of the manufacturing plants are in southern Brazil, right? But what happens there, when you build a power dam, when you block a river, right, you generate a huge social impact, environmental impact, local. The social impact and the environmental impact is local, right? And the beneficiary of that electricity is not local people. Most of that electricity goes to southern Brazil. And it's amazing, right? There are studies have been done that some communities that live just around the power dams, just near the power dams, they do not have access to electricity. You know, from my home, I can see the power dam. I open the window, I see the power dam, but I don't get that electricity. It's going to supply companies in southern Brazil. So that's environmental injustice, right?
Mhm.
So it's just an example of how the way these things happening in my part of the world, right? Another thing I'd like to say regarding, right, the killing of activists, right? I think it's something that it has become so normal, so normal. And I'm talking about a very violent country, right? Violence is endemic in Brazil for other reasons, right? Social inequality, income inequality, etc. Rio de Janeiro is a violent city. There's crime in São Paulo as well. But what happens is that it doesn't even make the news sometimes, because sometimes the news outlets are so busy with something else, right? Last month, for example, just last month, I think a couple of weeks ago, an indigenous leader was murdered. But you know what? The news is very busy with COVID and all these pandemics, so there's not enough space for on newspapers and TV programs to talk about those things. So if it doesn't make the news, it doesn't happen. It didn't happen. People don't know about it, and then it becomes normalized. That's my concern.
Absolutely. And I think it's a huge concern, right? I mean, when we when even, media is being censored and, truth is being withheld, it becomes quite a large issue. Dr. Thompson, did you have anything to say on the subject?
Yes. So one of the aspects that is in the States that isn't in Canada is there is environmental justice law, right? So they can be challenged based on the fact that it's inequitable risk. We can't do that here in Canada. So there are different laws. There is a super fund there and a requirement that rehabilitation be thought of upfront, right? There's a lot of work that has to be done in Canada, actually, to make things, to legislate environmental justice and really legislate health. Now, the one interesting aspect, now that it actually costs money to produce oil, right? And sell oil, where you're paying someone basically to take your oil, is that the economy is changing to a kind of cleanup model where we know we have to provide jobs to people in this crisis moment. And what are those jobs? They're for orphan oil wells, right? So I can see that as a public good, right? Is cleaning up things. It's unfortunate, it's horrible that the legislation wasn't there to create a super fund, to have the money to clean it up. The industry should have paid.
Mhm.
But we're all paying by these toxic waste sites. And as a trip down memory lane, that film took me back to my 2002 thesis, which I'm not sure if you can see, but I mapped toxic emissions, but I also mapped waste sites and Indigenous and census divisions. We can all do this. The information is available and showed very high statistical significance of emissions being close to First Nations reserves. And of course, I visited Pictou Landing and Boat Harbor, and it was nasty. So there are ways we can identify this and make it clear that that's not acceptable. And in Winnipeg, it's definitely in now Indigenous areas, North Point Douglas, there's South St. Boniface that are really are exposed because of actually now the new dirty industry that's often in urban areas is recycling. So which is we think of as a good, but when you're shredding automobiles, you're polluting with lead, you're polluting with all sorts of toxic particulate matter that it is at a very fine level that can get into your lungs. So we've placed these in many places. In Toronto, we have had lead smelters right downtown that have contaminated thousands of people. We've placed these in urban areas, and we have to completely rethink that. We have to, it's a disaster for these neighborhoods that have had a long history of providing homes for people, right? So cleanup has to occur, and we can't combine toxic industry with neighborhoods, especially low income and Aboriginal reserves, where they have the least infrastructure and the least possibility of moving. And so this policy has to change.
No, absolutely. And like you said, there's no way of escaping it in some of these places, right? Like there's no opportunity to move, or there's no conversation happening with people prior, like even showed in the film, like they basically tricked the people. They, flew them away. They said, oh, this is what it's going to look like, and didn't even show them the polluting area. They didn't show them the stacks of pollution that were happening. They showed them completely different, something different, and tricked them into believing you're going to be able to fish. You're going to be able to continue life as normal. And I think that, like you said, that's missing, as well as that forward thinking, like you said, the super funds in the United States, where you've set aside an amount for a cleanup, an exit strategy, if it may. right? And that's what hasn't been set apart, set aside here in a lot of Canadian law. You know, they are now pumping money into the cleanups, but this could have been a thought way back when these things were being created. So it's sort of that, you know, foresight to do the right thing, have that right thing in the end stake instead. I want to jump forward a bit more into just some of your experiences maybe with environmental racism sort of being the key topic of this video. Maybe just in a couple minutes with each of you to elaborate a bit on your experience with environmental racism or climate justice, and sort of, you know, it is happening, but is there a way to sort of tell people that it, you know, I don't think a lot of people realize it's sort of right under many of our noses, and maybe each of you could sort of explain your experience with those things. Or not, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I'll start. I mean, I've been a climate activist for a long time. I've met a lot of other really incredible climate activists, and they have much scarier stories than you know a privileged white male would have. Of course, my friends in Costa Rica, especially the females, they some of these people are very dear to me, very close friends, and I'm hearing from them all the time about how afraid they are to speak up and to go to these meetings in Costa Rica and a lot of Latin countries as well. Politics is very intimidating. I went to one meeting where they were discussing trawling, ocean trawling, and there were maybe 99% fishermen that were allowed in to watch the debate happen. And you know, I'm in there not really understanding a whole lot, and a few of my friends who are climate activists, and there's so much screaming and there's banging on the windows, and it's a very intimidating atmosphere. And I've never, even with all my work around Nova Scotia, I've never seen anything like that before. I've witnessed First Nations. Uh, I've witnessed arrests happen on First Nations. There's a few people, the grassroot grandmothers, they refer to them in the film. I know them as the water protectors. There's a few of them who I know who have been arrested. There's a young Indigenous girl. She's a part of the Fridays for Future and the School Strike for Climate movement. She grew up watching her mother get arrested in her entire life for fighting against the Alton Gas project. You know, and this happens right in my backyard. And you know, I've seen it happen all around. And in Canada, it's obviously it's not as frightening as it can be in other parts of the world, but it's again, like we were saying before, it's normalized. You know, the police come and they'll arrest people, and you know, nobody asks why are they being arrested. They're fighting for their land. They have treaty rights to this land, you know, and nobody asks those questions.
Yeah, far too often it is, you know, it seems like the power is with these corporations that are there possibly illegally. And, you know, it's, no, you're trespassing, so we're going to arrest you. And, you know, it just seems so many times like you said, Eric, it's not questioned, or like Eduardo had said, it's not publicized. You know, like no one knows this is happening, but it can be happening daily, not arrests, murders, people being killed for standing up for what is right. You know, it's pretty sad to see and hear.
Another issue is the billionaire companies have much better lawyers than the First Nations.
Absolutely.
May I just, yeah, I think it's important to discuss those issues. I think last month, March, there was over 200 increase in deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have the exact figure, but like a record deforestation in the Amazon. But that was March. The whole world was very busy talking about the pandemic. You know, so I mean, environmental activists were murdered in March, and the deforestation is just skyrocketed. It's out of control. But who's talking about that? I know about that because I studied that and I come from that place and I'm interested, right? But if it doesn't make the news, really, it's really, really complicated. So regarding your first question, so what can people do, right? What can we do? Where can we see or find hope, right? So if you look at those two sectors that were very well addressed in the film, right? There's the corporations, right? And the government, right? The government and the corporation, many times, most of the times they're working together to make sure that development initiatives move forward, right? So if you exclude the corporations and if you exclude government, what is left? What is left is civil society. It's civil society. It's us. It's non-profit organizations, environmental organizations. And my advice is for those who are interested, it's support environmental organizations, support civil society organizations, and universities. There are many academic programs studying those issues, addressing those issues, publishing papers and books to bring those issues to the public attention, right? So one thing that can be done at this point, right? Support civil society organizations that address those critical issues. Support universities, because that's what's left. That's what's left once you exclude corporations and government, right?
Absolutely. Dr. Thompson, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yes, I agree. That's a very good note. Like NGOs, non-government organizations in other countries play a critical role. And I think they could play a larger role here in Canada. I see the communities I work with don't have, Island Lake communities, Wasagamok First Nation, Garden Hill First Nation, so many communities. We have 33 communities, believe it or not, who don't have road access. Can you believe that? There is no way in or out except by plane. Crazy in Canada, in a rich country like Canada. So they also don't have banks, right? It's very hard then to create any economic development, to bring colleges. I'm actually working to bring a community development college where people are building houses, sustainable houses based on community designs in Wasagamok and Garden Hill First Nation. So for 2 years, these 30 people have been building houses. So we could very much, civil society, NGOs, colleges can step up. And if services aren't being provided, we have to, right? There's a call to. So when I did food security surveys and I found that there's 80% food insecurity in some of these northern Manitoba communities, and told government, and they said, so what? We've known about this for 20 years. Then it really begs us as civil society to step up and to actually do what we can. And we do have a lot of resources we can move. We can, our university resources are, instead of paying graduate students, I'm paying entry-level students. So there's all sorts of university professors, NGOs can work with First Nations and provide services. In Bangladesh, they provide actually loans to, and a banking system in the rural communities, right? If that's not happening, somebody has to do it. We can't just say, I think in Canada, we say government will do it. Well, government hasn't been doing it. So who then is going to do it? And
Right,
I think we have to take this on.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, a lot of times we're in a wait and see. We get into a holding pattern of, no, they've got to do it, right? They're going to. But it's funny when you bring up Bangladesh and Nepal and areas like that have had a lot more success in activism and with, eliminating plastic bags and with so many things that we haven't even, touched upon yet or just touching upon now that they've been doing for 20 years. It's pretty ridiculous that, like you said, we need to do it. we need to, encourage or enforce that the government takes legal action and standing on these. I am seeing and cognizant of time that it is 9 o'clock, but I want to jump into some of our questions. I have been looking at the YouTube questions that have been coming along as well. Seems like we've got a lot of people chatting on there, which is amazing, and I want to acknowledge all the people that are watching. Just scrolling quickly, I see potential. Okay, a question here. Richard Denton just saying, great to hear from you, Dr. Thompson. I believe is a colleague of yours in Toronto as well. So wanted to mention that. But I see a question about potential pathways for court involvement, which I'm not super versed on, but it says treaty law and reconciliation. Is there potential pathways for getting the courts involved? Like, do we have any knowledge of cases where courts were involved to protect people against polluters? Is there anything that you guys know of in that regard?
Well, definitely there has been some. I'm going to give the anti-scenario first, though, is mines in Manitoba through the land use regulation have the right to any greenstone area. So they have first dibs on this, and it can't be used for any other process, right? Or any other purpose, even if it's territorial traditional lands of First Nations. So in this case, Red Sucker Lake took a mining company to court and evicted them, and instead they were evicted. So often courts do not immediately side with Indigenous people. The court battle is a very long one, but definitely this has been working out around traditional territories in different areas, and around reconciliation. Courts often side with Indigenous people and their treaty rights, and so that is a way to go. I think that is possibly the strongest way to go, but it is also a very, very lengthy process.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know. There's a similar question, about suing governments for harming of Indigenous people. We look at the correlation of cancer in many of these places as well, as was brought up in the film. It seems like money, it's not the be all end all of what we want, but have people been compensated for these things? Or similarly, like, is there any legal recourse? It seems like that is the only recourse that people may listen to, but what can we do?
One issue I think is that starting a lawsuit like that, it's going to be a long process, and it takes a lot of money to get going. And the communities that are affected and most vulnerable, they don't have the money to put up front for legal fees.
Absolutely.
That's right. And you usually have to take it to the highest level, which is very, very time consuming. So what are other ways? There is citizen science. There is, definitely community development showing an alternative pathway, and First Nations giving them more say, right? It is giving them the platform, inviting them to talks like this, right? As ways where their voices are the most important to be heard around traditional territories. And there are lots of studies that show that Indigenous people, more than any other group, are effective at conservation and biodiversity. So those areas that are, under the in stewardship of Indigenous people have the highest biodiversity. So I think that is key, is similar to this film, is listening to the water protectors and definitely telling their story, or giving a audience so that they can hear their story.
Absolutely. Eduardo?
Yeah, I think these are just great comments and ideas. And I was listening to the other speakers, I was just thinking about something that I read recently, and that I had learned about this thing before. But now with this pandemic situation, you know, there are scholars and experts who have written papers and academic papers in the past about the risk of epidemics and endemics and pandemics happening as a result of deforestation processes, right? As you deforest a piece of land, as you destroy the environment, and as you displace or kill animals, right? Many of which have viruses that up to now have been, you know, just kept inside the forest, inside forest environments. But once we cut down the trees and once we destroy their environments, there's a possibility in the future, right, that viruses that up to now are unknown to humanity will be, I mean, in touch with our society, right? So I think it's something to be considered. I once heard, I was watching a documentary a long time ago. I heard something that I never forgot. The guy said, nature will always have the last laugh. Nature will always win. Nature will always win, right? So we are the guests. We humans, we are the guests. We are not the owners. We are guests. We are here. We're part of the ecosystem, right? So I think this is one of the lessons that the world has been learning with this pandemic is the concern for the environment, the concern for preserving livelihoods and respecting animals and other forms of life, right? And I think that's a lesson that has to be learned. And I'm very concerned again about increasing deforestation in the Amazon, even more now because of the current circumstances, right?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I think you guys bring up amazing points. Last thing I want to touch on, last question. I know we've gone over time, but just sort of a minute each, if you could. You know, there's a lot of situations that are very similar to what's been going on in Nova Scotia, across Canada, around the world. One of our viewers asked about Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland, but saying that, is there a way to prevent like communities that may be in a similar situation from going down the same path as has happened in Nova Scotia? And it may be Muskrat Falls, it may be, like you said, Dr. Thompson, in Manitoba with hydro dams and communities basically at risk of flooding because of hydroelectric dams that have happened there. Is there some sort of, what can we do with communities that may be in similar cases or about to embark in situations, if they are even, you know, contacted by companies prior to these things happening? What might we be able to do? Like I said, maybe just a minute each, if you've got any ideas on that.
Maybe I'll start then. So we do need a regenerative economy, right? So transitioning, or, you know, this COVID-19, I think we are jumping into a new era where we're seeing that these big factory farms do not work. These big, few slaughterhouses, right? They're all closed in Alberta. So we're seeing that the industrial economy is ineffective. And so we have to think, you know, go to the cause, right? And change the economy from a toxic economy to a regenerative economy, to a caring economy, to a healthy economy. And that's the role of government, is to create a sustainable, healthy economy. And we are no longer in the status quo, right? We are out of the status quo. COVID-19 has taken us out of the status quo. So the government cannot just be protecting the rich and the status quo, and now has to you know, create an economy that works for everyone. And we're seeing a bit of that, like hopeful signs. They haven't moved to a you know, basic income, but there's a lot. There's pieces of it, right?
Absolutely. No, well stated. Eric, Eduardo, any comments? Go ahead, Eric.
For me, I think the most important thing is to keep talking about the issues, to keep discussing what's happening in our communities and in communities around us. You know, the more we discuss the environmental racism, the more people will come together to fight against it. You know, we owe a lot to the First Nations. They do a lot for us. The Alton Gas project, for example, in the Shubenacadie River, near to my home, at this point, it's all a legal battle. The 2 months ago, the First Nations in the province and Alton Gas all went to court, and then just last month, the Supreme Court sided with First Nations, saying that they weren't adequately consulted, and it was sort of a technicality because our environment minister at the time, who I'm not a fan of at all, made a big mistake and only addressed the environmental impacts, not the fact that it was that the First Nations have land rights, they have treaty rights. So if that aspect wasn't there, Alton Gas would already be in operation right now. You know, we owe a lot to the First Nations. They do a lot for our land that we all share, and we have to keep fighting back for them. Furthermore, we have to remember that, you know, we're, especially during a time like this, that we're all so interconnected. You know, it's being a climate activist, for whatever reason you get into it, you know, it's not just about hugging trees, it's about human rights. And so we need to stand up for each other. And the more we do that, the stronger our community will be.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. Eduardo?
I entirely agree with Dr. Thompson and Eric. Yeah, I think it's important that we give a voice to those people who are being affected. It's important that they get space in the news, space in the media, that they get their voice heard by a wider and wider audience, right? And now there's, with the power of internet and Facebook and Instagram and all the tools that we have, it's very easy to get their message spread all over the country, the world, etc. But going back to my context in the Brazilian Amazon rainforest, there's an additional comment I would like to make prior to the implementation. And I would say even prior to the design of development projects, right? There's a need, and it happens, right, for consultation processes to take place, right? And we all know what those consultation processes are all about, right? You meet with the community and then you discuss the project with the community. But it's important to make sure that those consultation processes do not become simple communication processes when you just tell the community what's going to happen, right? And you provide some kind of compensation that many times, most of the time, is not adequate, right? And nobody talks about veto power. Do communities have a veto power at the end of the process, right? If they choose to do so, right? If they don't want a project, so is there a veto power included in that consultation process? Because if there's a veto power included, then there must be negotiation, 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 until an agreement is reached, right? So those are comments I would like to make for now.
Amazing. I can't thank you three enough for being here, and for everyone who's taken part in watching the video with us, commenting on things. You know, I think it's so important, like you guys have all touched upon, social media, getting involved. There's so many ways to get involved. You know, so many people don't know where to start or how to tackle things, and it can seem like an insurmountable amount of things that you need to do, and it can be overwhelming to want to make such a change, to know that a change is needed, but to not know where to start. And, you know, that's why there's so many great NGOs to get behind. There's so many great groups to get behind and join up with. I'm just gonna to mention one. I know this Friday coming up, Manitoba Youth for Climate Action here is doing an event called Make Some Noise for Climate, where, you know, they'd love to do a strike all together and a parade like September 27th strikes, but are instead from 10 a.m. till 11 in the morning, telling people to tune into U of W radio 95.9 and do basically your own isolation parade. You know, make some noise, turn on the radio, just get loud and basically in solidarity for the environment. You know, and you can find events on Facebook, you can find events through Twitter, through Instagram, and I think that's how people found us here and have listened to, you know, you three amazing speakers, sharing some of your knowledge with us. And I know we've reached that hour of our chat, and I just wanted to thank you three again so very much for joining us. I wish you were all just here and we could chat and we could just continue this for hours and hours. But I respect we've got home lives and you guys have home lives, and some of us are on the East Coast where it's a little later. So again, thank you three for being a part of this. Thank you everyone for viewing, and I wish you all a wonderful end to your Earth Day, and stay safe during this time.
Happy Earth Day, everyone. Thanks for putting this on.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
It was a great event. Happy Earth Day.
Thank you so very much. Take care, guys.